Welcome to Seniority Authority, the podcast where I track down experts to answer your questions on aging. I'm your host, Kathleen Toomey. Let's get smarter about growing older. Consider these facts. Today, 1 in 5 Americans are caregivers to an older adult, according to AARP, and that number is expected to dramatically increase. And 51% of caregivers did not financially prepare for the cost of care. The third surprising statistic to me is that since 2011, caregivers lost on average $304,000 in lost income and benefits over their lifetime. The reason? There's no roadmap for aging and caregiving right now. Most people just did not expect to live this long, nor did they anticipate needing care, and the ramifications are significant. How do I know this? Through the MIT AgeLab. They are actively researching health, wellness, technology, and how to help people prepare to face their future with eyes open and new tools and ideas at the forefront. Welcome to Seniority Authority. I'm your host, Kathleen Toomey. My guest today is Adam Feltz, a research associate at the MIT AgeLab. With his colleagues at the AgeLab, Adam conducts research on how people think and plan for longevity, or how they don't, as well as how family caregivers experience and navigate their role of caring for a loved one. A key question for Adam is how people conceptualize the good life in older age, and whether caring for people, other people, might fit into that conception. Adam received a master's degree in theological studies from Boston University in 2020. Thanks to our show sponsor, the Riverwoods Group, Northern New England's largest family of not-for-profit continuing care retirement communities, where independent, active adults find purpose, community, and peace of mind. Visit us at riverwoodsgroup.org. Now, let's hear from today's guest. Welcome to Seniority Authority, Adam.
Thank you for having me, Kathleen. It's great to be chatting with you.
I am so excited about the work of the MIT AgeLab and have been reading your newsletters and looking at your research for many, many years. And as we've discussed, you're involved in a lot of research at the AgeLab, and you identified 3 main goals that the AgeLab is trying to achieve. What are those?
I would say that the first goal of the AgeLab is to explore social demographic change, how the population is changing from a demographic perspective. And kind of the main demographic shift that we're focused on, as one might guess based on our name, is people are living longer than ever before. And the implications of that fact of an aging population are myriad, are abundant. And so not only do we look to track some of the demographic shifts that are happening in the United States, we try to understand what those shifts mean for people. And of course, one of the major implications of an aging population is the growth of unpaid family caregivers in the United States. More older people means more people who need care in the US and more people who have to provide that care. The second thing that we look at the AgeLab, and it's connected, of course, to the first thing, is we try to explore and advocate for the idea that aging is a good thing. It's a success story.
Amen. Amen. You're speaking my language.
It's a success story. The longer lifespans are a success story, a massive success story that has taken place over the last century. And getting older for an individual is a success story. It means that you've managed to make it into old age, and that's not something that's guaranteed. But culturally speaking, and this is a long-standing feature of how we think about aging, people often don't think about it as a success story or something to look forward to. It has deep negative connotations. Old age does. And at the AgeLab, we try to fashion a narrative in which old age is seen as something aspirational. And that is not characterized just by challenges, and difficulties that are real aspects of old age, but it's also characterized by good things in life, that there are plenty of things to look forward to in old age. And we can start to think of old age potentially more in terms of those things and less in terms of the bad things. And I think the third thing that we focus on at the AgeLab is how we might design products, services, policies, experiences that will allow older people to live better lives. The older adult market in the United States is a massive market. It encompasses over $1 trillion of wealth, but companies do not make products that are commensurate, or rather the attention of these companies is not commensurate with the size or the need or the desires. And I think desires is a key point of this market. And so we're working to try to help businesses or policymakers or anybody who is involved in helping older people to better understand this population and to better design things for them that they're going to need and that they're going to want.
And that's a great combination, the inflection of need and creativity and technology that MIT is known for. And the AgeLab has been around for a long time, right?
Yeah, I think we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year.
Okay. And now is the time where this trajectory of the amazing growth of older adults and the consequent shrinking of the workforce are really pivotal right now in terms of the environment we're living in.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're all dealing with a confluence of a much older population. And as people age out of the workforce and retire, that shrinks the number of people who can provide services to those older people. So there's an interaction there of shrinking need and demand for services, I mean, specifically for older adults, and shrinking supply, labor supply from the younger population. And I think a major place where that's playing out, maybe the major place, is the labor of care. There is a deficit of professional care labor in the United States and elsewhere in the world. That is part of the reason why care is so expensive and why it's so hard to get professional care. And it's part of the reason why it's so common for people to be heavily involved as unpaid caregivers.
That is exactly right. I mean, I am in this world, so it wasn't surprising to me that 1 out of 5 people were caring for an older adult in the United States. But I think to most people, that would be shocking. And that is just this point in time, and it's just going to increase. And I love that you're focused on caregiving research as well as defining the reality for people so that they understand what their life is going to look like. So, let's talk about the new actuarial studies that you and I were talking about earlier that reveal that a healthy, financially stable woman or in her 40s today can expect to live to 90 on average. Are people, in your opinion, aware of that average trajectory?
Yeah, first, I want to appreciate the way that you highlight average as a key word in that statement, because I mean, it means some people are going to end up under that average, but it also means a significant number of people are going to end up over that average. And so there's a significant number of that population, affluent women in their 40s and other people too, not just to focus on that particular subgroup, who can have a decent shot of expecting to live to age 100. And based on the research that I do, that is not something that people are aware of. People certainly aren't aware of that data. And I think more broadly, they're just not thinking in terms of the probability that they're going to live into a phase of life into their 80s or 90s. And in the past was pretty uncommon. People did live that old. People have always been able to live that old, but it was way less common. And now it's almost the norm. But people don't think that way. When we ask people how long they think they're going to live in our surveys, in a recent survey that we did in 2023, the average that we got from people, and this is younger people who probably are going to enjoy even longer lifespans due to continuing advances in medicine and public health, they guessed that they were going to live to be around 73 years old. And
Wow.
the thing that I can say to them is like, you're probably wrong. But I think the reason why they predict or that they lowball their lifespan so much is because they don't have an idea of what their lives even would be like in their 80s or their 90s or in, as centenarians. They can't imagine it. And so they peg their lifespans at basically at about the point where they can, the end point of their imagination of what is even possible for them.
I love that. I love that that is as far as they can go, because I think that buys into this whole collective ostrich-like head in the sand approach that we all have to aging that is so embedded in our culture that birthday cards at 40, you're over the hill, and all of these celebrating youth and denigrating age. And so I think you're right. There is no roadmap for that. But listeners, if you are listening, think about that. Your 40-year-old child, or if you're 40, is going to have an opportunity, if they're financially stable and get regular health care, to live to an average of 90, but 90 and beyond. So we have to really shift how we think about everything in our lives. And importantly, what gives us purpose in that last chapter. And I think, Adam, MIT AgeLab has ideas on how they think we should rethink aging. What would you say? How are you trying to help people reconsider aging?
That's a great question. I think something that I kind of want to highlight maybe before I actually answer the question is that old age often tends to get framed in a negative way. And that's not an affliction, I guess you could say, of modern life. Old age has been perceived as negative for a long time. I think going back to Shakespeare, some of Shakespeare's best stuff is just talking about how rough it is to be old. I'm thinking about like King Lear, for example. You want to go even further back, there's an essay by Cicero, who was a guy who lived during the Roman Empire, who was trying to defend the idea that it's possible to have a good life in old age. He's imagining sort of this argument where it's like, once you're old, everything falls apart. And he's like, no, it's not true. It depends.
Oh my gosh, I have not read that. I've got to look that up and put it in the show notes for folks. Because at Cicero's time, old age was 30?
Well,
40?
no, not necessarily. So
okay.
Life expectancy may have been 30, but that's because it was hard for people to get out of, say, childhood. But people still had the same idea of old age as we do. It's when your hair turns gray and you get wrinkly and your bones density shrinks, and that all of that I think was largely the same. Like the same idea, even though far fewer people made it there.
Right.
Still the same idea, and people were still down on it. They were like, "This is this is when things fall apart."
That's good to know.
Yeah. So, we're working against a long history of, I guess, conceptions of old age that tend to be negative. And there are reasons why people think about aging in this way. It does correspond with changes in our bodies and our brains that can be called decline. And it does come with challenges. But I think what we focus on at the AgeLab is that that's not all there is to it. And I think one important fact that I like to focus on that a lot of people don't realize is that older people, at least as far as social scientific research understands it, are happier. Older people are the happiest people. They are happier than younger people, and they are definitely happier than people in midlife. People in midlife are the unhappiest people. And
I love that research. I love that.
Maybe something that you've talked about before on the podcast. And I think when
you're talking about the U-shaped curve of happiness.
That's exactly right. And I think, whenever I mention this to people in midlife, they're like, yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. But this isn't widely known. People don't seem in the popular consciousness to be aware of the fact that old age is the happiest time of life. And I think the reason for that is because the only way you would know that is by asking an older person how they feel. It's experiential rather than superficial. You can't look at an older person and see that they're happy. They're going to look old instead.
Yeah.
You have to actually hear from them how they're feeling and what their experiences are. And we don't we often don't do that. And so I think one key aspect of maybe redefining how we think about old age, or one key project, is to listen to older people and understand better how they experience old age and what it's like for them in a
Hmm.
more complete way. Because you're not going to figure that out just by looking.
I've talked about the U-shaped curve of happiness in a couple places, and I believe there was a book called The Happiness Advantage. But this research goes back a while, and it posits that you think you are going to be happiest at middle age when you have achieved marriage and children and career success, etc. But that also interacts with the time that you are most pressured
Yes,
and
right.
have the most stress in your life. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's right. So all those things that you just named, they're great, but they also come with responsibilities. So the peak of your career means the peak of career responsibility. Having kids means the peak of family responsibility. And then the other piece of it, I think that is becoming increasingly common, is the other responsibility that people are facing in midlife is providing care to their
Mm.
parents. And so you have people in what's called the sandwich generation, in which they're simultaneously caring for young children and caring for the parents at the same time, and they're working. And how anybody is able to balance all three of those things is completely, to me, even as
Yeah.
somebody who studies this, I have no idea how people do it. But people are doing it in large numbers, probably by the millions of people in the United States.
Let's dive into that topic of family caregivers. And here we're talking about unpaid family caregivers, not the professionals. And I think it was shocking to a lot of people to hear at the top of the show that 1 out of 5 Americans today is a caregiver for an older adult. Would you say, based on your research, is it by choice, by lack of planning, lack of finances, lack of available professional caregivers? What has caused this epidemic of family caregiving?
Yeah, I think I would point to three causes, and I would say that it's not just these three, but there are three that I can talk about to begin with. The first cause, I think, for this number is going back to this demographic change, that it's more likely that our parents are going to reach their 80s or their 90s, and more likely during those decades of their lives that they're going to need help from other people in order to live a good life. And the need for that help creates demand for care. And that care can come from professional caregivers, or it can come from family members, or it can come potentially in adaptations in an older person's home to allow them to continue living independently without care. And I think that might take us to maybe the second reason, which has to do with policy or economics. And that has to do with the fact that professional care is prohibitively expensive. And that is the case whether you're thinking about bringing professional care into your home, or bringing an older person or a person in need of care into an institutional setting, such as an assisted living facility or a nursing home. That's particularly true for people who have middle incomes. So there's this idea of this kind of pressured middle, or maybe it's the neglected middle, that people in assisted living talk about, where if you have low income, Medicaid will cover your need for a nursing home. If you have high income, you can afford it. But there are no options available for people of middle incomes to receive institutional professional care for something like dementia. Instead, they have to liquidate everything that they have and use all of the money that they have in order to get government assistance for professional care, which is extremely difficult. In lieu of doing that, you have instead people who take on the role of family care themselves as unpaid family caregivers.
And when we're talking care, it ranges, but at some point, if you can't manage your own medications, or if you need help bathing or dressing or in the shower, you need some kind of care in that. And Medicare does not cover that.
Health insurance doesn't cover care expenses. The one form of insurance, or maybe not the one, but most commonly, the form of insurance that did cover those kinds of expenses was long-term care insurance. But the market for long-term care insurance, which is just you pay for a policy in expectation that you'll need to pay for care in the future, and then the policy will kick in and pay for that. The market for that product, that financial product has collapsed because care is too expensive.
Hmm.
Like there's no way to make it work even when you design a financial product in order to deal with the cost. It's at least right now, we don't have a means of doing that to make an insurance that works to cover those kinds of expenses.
There was a
Um,
real implosion in the long-term care industry about, I don't know, 5 to 7 years ago, where they had made a lot of money on long-term care policies and then started realizing that the actuarial tables they used were not working because people were living too long. So
yes.
a lot of companies exited that industry, and now there are some new products coming on board, but they're not inexpensive.
Hmm.
And I think the devil's in the details. You really have to know what you're getting into.
Hmm.
So what you're saying is the reason that there are so many family caregivers is because of cost. And I think the second one that you were going to mention is there are fewer caregivers out there.
Hmm.
So supply and demand, the ones that are there are more costly.
And
And it's hard to find them, even if you do decide that you're going to be hiring them.
and there's one other factor that I would mention, which is preference or
Hmm.
choice, which is
Okay.
that when a family member needs help, it's natural that we want to help them. And sometimes even for people who can afford to move a loved one into an institutional setting or bring in professional care, they don't want to do that, or their loved one doesn't want to do that because they feel that it's an intimate familial duty to do it. And so they will do it themselves because they feel like they should. They feel like that's what they ought to do, which makes sense. It's a very natural impulse to want to care for your family members. And I guess another piece of that too is I don't want to narrow what it means to be a caregiver too much in that even if you can afford to put a family member into an institutional setting, and you do, you're still their caregiver. You're still
Hmm.
checking in on them to see how they're doing and interfacing with their medical providers and going to the institution to visit them and worrying about them and doing all these other things, even though they're receiving professional care, you're still their caregiver. So even though this is already really hard, it's not so easy as providing institutional or professional resources to provide care to people. There's still a family element involved, inevitably. And I don't think there's any way to fix that. That's just part of having family.
Yeah, that because someone has to be their advocate,
Yes.
no matter where they are, whatever residential community or assisted living or memory support, you have to advocate for someone. And I highly recommend that older adults who have someone in their lives that can accompany them to an important doctor's appointment or something like that, bring someone who is that second set of eyes and ears that's understanding the diagnosis, the test, that can ask some questions of the doctor just to make sure you're getting the right advice and suggestions.
Yeah, a lot of doctors are not trained to communicate
Yeah.
clearly to older people.
Yeah.
They just say what the way that they would say it to anybody. And sometimes an older person is like, I have no idea what you just said to me right now. Sometimes I feel that way as well. It's not just an older
Yeah,
person
it's not
saying
just
it.
that, but I think we have that also that generational 1950s kind of the doctor is the expert. I don't want to
Yes.
question the doctor, whatever the doctor says. Medicine today is more collaborative. It's more
Yes.
the doctor says you have this diagnosis. There's several different ways we could do. What would you prefer?
Yes.
And having experience with some of this, the older adults like, what do you mean? What do I prefer? I'm not the doctor. You tell me. But it's really collaborative and participative, and that's the better choice. And we have other options. Now, we've been talking a lot about family caregivers as kind of the younger person helping the older adult, whether it's a parent or grandparent, uncle, aunt. But in some cases, caregiving can be really symbiotic, as in the beautiful story of your grandparents who are extraordinary. And so it can be spouse and it can be supportive. Can you talk a little bit about how your grandparents have navigated this in such a beautiful way?
Of course. I think the first thing I want to say is I think caregiving is necessarily symbiotic, at least to some degree or another, because caregiving describes a relationship between two people who are collaborating and compromising in order to keep life going and making their lives the way that they want it to be. And sometimes that symbiotic relationship can be challenging and sometimes it can be easy. But I think that's the way it is. And I really like to focus on the idea that caregiving is almost always a collaborative process between two people. I think the labels of caregiver and care recipient can give the impression of the idea that there is like a subject, an actor, the caregiver, and an object, the caregiver. And the caregiver is the one who's doing stuff, and the care recipient is the one who's being acted on and not doing anything, being passive. And that's very rarely the case. In fact, you have two people who are working together in order to keep life going. And this is, I think, I described to you the situation between my grandparents. Before I talk about what they've learned how to do, I'll talk about their situation, which is that my grandfather had a stroke about a decade ago that left him unable to walk. He lost the use of his left side, and he still lives at home with my grandmother, who takes care of them. And they're close to 90 years old now. And every single morning, my grandmother gets my grandfather out of bed and into his wheelchair. And my grandmother is like 5'2". She's a petite 90-year-old woman. And my grandfather is a 200-pound man who is paralyzed on his left side. And
Oh my
nonetheless,
God.
she is able to lift him up every single day by herself from his bed into his wheelchair.
That's amazing.
The way that
amazing.
I know, it honestly doesn't make sense to me when I really think about it. But I know that the way that they're able to do this is, one, is a lot of practice, and two, they work together. If my grandfather wasn't helping her, she would not be able to do that herself. It's the fact that he still has the use of his body, his right side, and is able to kind of enact this dance with her every morning to move him into his chair. That's the way they're able to do it. There's no other way she would be able to accomplish it otherwise. And it's through that kind of collaboration that they're able to continue living the life that they want to live, which is being together in their home, the same home that they've been in now for, I think, the last 60 or 70 years of their lives. And the way they're able to do that is by working together.
That is wonderful. And getting a little emotional. That's a real gift to your family, and it shows the strength of that relationship, that they are literally supporting each other to make sure that they can live every day, and that it's hard to do. It is hard to do. If you're getting smarter, let us know. Leave us a review or rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell your friends and follow us on social. We're at Seniority Authority on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And don't forget, if you're listening to YouTube, hit the notification bell so you can subscribe. Or subscribe to our newsletter at seniorityauthority.org so you don't miss a thing. I want to ask you a question. For family caregivers, and there may be some in the audience that do not have as symbiotic a relationship as your grandparents. One of the things that I want to point out about your grandparents is your grandfather understands and accepts his limitations and knows that he needs to work around them, use his right side to compensate for his left side. I think a lot of our older adults are less accepting of what they can no longer do well, and put the family caregivers in a challenging situation. So I know this is an area of focus and specialty of yours. What do you recommend our listeners do in that situation?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd want to say is that, unfortunately, or just this is a part of life, I think, my grandparents fight all the time. And they fight about caregiving. It's not easy.
I love that. Okay. Not crying anymore.
Yeah. They squabble at each other, or they're from the South, so they say they fuss at each other all the time. And so I don't know if anybody can escape from that aspect of the relationship, is that there's going to be conflict, and it's going to be hard, and there's going to be stubbornness, and there's going to be differences in how people think they should deal with a situation. That's part of it for everybody. Another example that comes to mind for me is we have this panel of older adults who are ages 85 and older at the AgeLab, and we talk to them about their experiences with everything. And one of the things we talk about them with is caregiving. And we had a participant when we were talking about caregiving who was reminiscing about caring for his spouse. And he kind of looked ahead and he was like, eventually, you're going to end up hating each other. And he said this in such a, and then he kind of chuckled and he said it in this very kind of light and accepting way. And I don't think he was trying to say that he hates his wife. I think he was trying to just make the point that like conflict is part of this relationship, the caregiving relationship. It's hard and it creates some really challenging dynamics. But with all that said, I think one thing that I've heard most recently in my research is some data that I've encountered is there's this distinction between, or we found that caregivers were really likely to report that their care recipient was stubborn. It's like a really high rate of reports of stubbornness. Now that's how caregivers saw their care recipient.
Okay.
But the rate of conflict was much lower than the rate of stubbornness. And so even though these care recipients for these caregivers are stubborn or a pain, they figured out ways maybe to cope with this feeling of obstinacy that maybe sometimes their care recipient puts up. And based on interviews that we did alongside this survey where we got this data, we heard a lot of caregivers talking about the strategy of picking their battles, choosing when they're going to put up a fight with their care recipient when there's a difference of opinion about what the right course of action is, and maybe recognizing when it's essential to get into that conflict and when it's okay to say, you know, even though I really want you to do this thing and it stresses me out that you're not doing it, it's not essential. And I need to let you make your own choices when you're able to and accept that I can't have control over you sometimes, even when sometimes it really stresses me out that I don't. And that's not easy. But an example that really came up in this study was nutrition. A lot of caregivers were stressed out about their care recipient's diet. They're like, he or she is not eating well. I worry how it's going to impact their health. I wish I had more control over how my care recipient or my loved one eats. But often what they say afterwards is this is something that they get to decide for themselves. And as their independence has changed, the number of things that they get to decide for themselves has decreased. This is one of the things that they still have and that they enjoy. And I'm not going to take that from them. And they're still an adult. And if they want to eat like crap, then that's their choice. And I have to live with that. And so being able to kind of be at peace sometimes with not having control, I think, at least on the caregiver side, that's a really important thing, at least that we've heard in our research.
I couldn't agree more, because I think when you say the word stubborn, what that says to me is control. And as we age, we don't have as much control. Part of aging is your body changes. It's not as strong. Your mind changes, not as sharp. So some things you can no longer do. You may not be safe to drive. You may not be safe to do this or that. And I think the stubbornness is that care recipient's desire to control some aspect of their life. Like they've lived alone and done what they've wanted to do their whole lives. And suddenly there's somebody in their face that they need helping them to either do laundry or errands or groceries, and they know they need it, but they don't want it. And the stubbornness is saying, I still want control. Would that be a good analysis?
I think that's very astute. I think that's right. I think one of the biggest challenges of needing care is you lose this autonomy that you've had for so much of your life. And it's really hard. And you're going to want to assert that autonomy when you're able to, because that's kind of a fundamental feature of being human, is wanting to be an agent and make choices for yourself. And yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah, that's nicely put. What advice do you have for our listeners who are negotiating conflict with a care recipient who wants to live independently, but is no longer safe to do so? Nutrition aside and what kinds of clothes you want to wear, but what's your research tell you about the best way to approach something when it has to do with safety and living independently?
Yeah, this was a helpful question to get in advance of the podcast. Me to think
It's
about.
hard, right?
Yeah. Um, I think the answer that I think I have, hopefully it's a good one, is when we think about the question as you phrased it, which I think the way you phrased it makes a lot of sense. I focus on two words in it, which is independence and safety. These seem like the two values that are in conflict with each other. And the thing that I think maybe is a first step is to get into what we mean by independence and safety. So in the case of independence, obviously really important, but it's also kind of broad and vague. It's like, how do you start to break that down and understand what this person wants? What do they want to be able to do? What do they want their environment to look like? And to really explore, what do we mean here by independence? What are the things that you want? And similarly with safety, again, really important, but also kind of vague. How do you begin to break down what you mean by safety? What risks are you worried about as the caregiver? How do you think it's going to be possible to mitigate those risks? Really talking in greater detail and in greater depth about what you mean and what you're hoping for and what you're valuing in a situation like this, so that both people are really heard in what they want. And practically speaking, you can then begin to address those wants and say, okay, I hear that what you want to be able to do is this. What is a solution that we can come to so that you can still do this thing that you really want to do, but I can feel less worried about this thing that makes me worried that you're going to be unsafe. So there's a practical aspect there of coming up with a solution that meets with these needs and these wants. And there's an emotional aspect too. I think, these kind of interactions are deeply emotional, and sometimes I think probably requires like help from some kind of therapist,
Mm-hmm.
and that people need to feel like they're being heard. And I think this is especially the case maybe for a care recipient who feels like their life is being taken away from them. They need to be heard, and to have someone here, these are the things that I feel like I'm going to lose if I have to leave my home. And this is how I feel about losing those things. And doing that work of expressing this fear of loss is, I think, really important to then move toward kind of these practical steps of addressing these issues that a caregiver or a loved one is seeing. So I think my advice is just like get deeper and understand kind of what's underneath these bigger issues.
I love that. I think that's right on point. And it is also reminds me of Atul Gawande in his book, Being Mortal, where he talks about what is important to you in life and can we help you achieve that? Is it eating ice cream? Is it going to your grandson's baseball? What is important to you? So you're putting the care recipient in the driver's seat saying, what's meaningful? What's important? And how can we do that together? And then what can you let go of, both as a care recipient and the caregiver? And it's just taking a breath and having that conversation in a calm way, I think would really help to shift the dynamic.
Yeah, I imagine I read Gawande's book years ago, but probably that's who I was channeling when I gave that answer, like somewhere deep in my brain. It's an excellent book.
It's such a great book for those who haven't read it that listen to Seniority Authority. Shame on you. No, I'm kidding. That's one of the Bibles of, I think, understanding aging, end of life is Atul Gawande's Being Mortal. And it shifts a whole approach from a Western-based medical intervention to putting the person at the center of the process and saying what's important to you. And then let's figure out how we can achieve that. And if we can't achieve it, can we come close with some accommodations?
Mm-hmm.
Because it does then turn it back to the care recipient saying, you're in control of your life. I'm here to help you figure out what you can't figure out or what you need help with. But I want to help you live the life that you want and enjoy as much as you possibly can while being at a different stage than when you were 30 or 40. So I love that. I love that answer. There are so many resources on the MIT AgeLab webpage, which is amazing. If you guys haven't checked it out, the link is in the show notes, including one that I thought was fascinating, mapping the caregiver journey. And this map and these resources are to help illustrate the experience and are gathered from all your research and studies. What do you hope people will learn from the mapping the caregiver journey?
So the first thing I have to say about that is, and this isn't to dissuade anybody from looking at it, but it's just to contextualize it, is that it's mainly directed toward other researchers and maybe businesses or other professionals who potentially have a say in designing products or services for caregivers. So it's more of like a researcher to business or researcher to researcher kind of resource. That's not to say that anybody can't look at it. I think it could still be really interesting for a person to look at it, but that's kind of who the intended audience for it is. And with that said, I think the idea of these journey maps is to help somebody, and again, maybe thinking from the perspective of a designer, a product designer, to understand who this person is that they might be designing for, what their needs might be, what their unmet needs might be, what kind of the trajectory of their life is, what a day in their life looks like, and to understand what challenges that they're dealing with and where a product or a service might be able to fit into a caregiver's life to meet an unmet need. And so the idea, I think, is to give information to people who are making stuff for this population who don't know enough yet about them. Because, unfortunately, there's still not a lot of attention given to the older adult market and to the caregiver market to really understand what is going on with these folks. What do they need? And how can we give it to them in a way that's actually going to work for them? So that resource is to help inform people to understand this is what this population is like. This is what they're dealing with. Here's a way that you might be able to understand them a little better to guide your thinking when you design things for them.
Let's talk about the research you have been doing on family caregiver. What are the most exciting developments or learning from all of this research that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Something that's exciting to me is when I talk to caregivers in qualitative research, like qualitative meaning interviews or focus groups, and we ask them what they need to be better caregivers or that would help them as caregivers. The things that they tell us are not like shooting a rocket to the moon. They're pretty simple stuff that is pretty attainable. So just to give a couple of examples, I think when we talk to caregivers about their self-care and how they can better take care of themselves, what we often heard from people was, if I could just have one day a month where I could just focus exclusively on taking care of myself and not have to worry about my care recipient, just one day a month, that would make a world of difference to me. And what people are describing when they say that is something called respite care. So a day in which a care provider comes in to provide a caregiver respite. And what we hear, what's implied by this when people say this is that they don't have that one day a month. Yeah. They don't have that, which is really, that's not exciting. That's hard to hear, that
it's
people
draining.
Are not able. Yeah, it's this accumulation of responsibility and duty and stress that eventually burns people out. And what we hear from people is if they could just have one day a month, and maybe this is what people are imagining, maybe they need more than that, but at least what they say is, if I could just have one day more a month, I could do this. I think I could handle it way better. And that seems like something that is pretty attainable. I think another thing that we hear from people about what they need is just more information about caregiving. So I talked to a few people recently in interviews who said when they entered into the caregiving role, so one example was a woman whose husband developed dementia and she became his caregiver. She said she had no idea what was going to happen. She thought dementia meant he's going to forget the names of things and that's it. She didn't realize that it was going to eventually eliminate all of his independent capacities in the advanced stage. She had no idea. And she had to just learn this on the fly. And so if it could be possible to target somebody in that situation with information about something as simple as this is what dementia is and this is how it's going to go, to do that in a proactive way and in a way that helps people plan accordingly and make proactive decisions, that could be transformative. Another example kind of in that genre is there's a guy I talked to who said he didn't understand fall risk for his mom. He didn't understand that he had to transition his mom from one living situation to another, that transition vastly increases a frail person's fall risk because they're unfamiliar with the new environment. And so they become more likely to trip and fall. He didn't know that. He had no idea that that was something that he needed to worry about and maybe mitigate against. And if it had been possible to tell him that, to get information to him in a proactive way based on his situation, based on the fact that his mom is in need of care and undergoing a living transition, could have prevented a fall. And that could be dramatic for both the care recipient and the caregiver. So there are things out there that we can do that, for example, health insurance companies can do, or other providers of information or services that are pretty doable. We just have to do them.
I think that's terrific. And what I would say to our listeners is if you are listening and you know of a family caregiver, think about what you could do to help them out. Could you be there one day a month and say to the caregiver, go off, take a walk, get some exercise, do what you need to do? That's something practical that you could do. And we've talked in this show a lot about mentoring and gaining access to resources. And I would say if you are a caregiver, seek out those resources, learn, because I work in this industry. But for people and friends of mine that call me, they don't know where to even start to get information and to get help. And that's why we started this podcast, is so that it's a place for people to go. You can go on the website, you can look at, here's the topic I'm concerned about, listen to that episode, and it will give you some practical tips. So educate yourself wherever you can. So I think those two things are game changers. So, Adam, when you are out at a party or at a ball game and you're not doing what you do and your friends talk to you, and what does your work now inspire you to tell people who are younger about getting old or caregiving? Like how does this spill over into your life when people say, oh, what are you doing? And that's interesting. What do you say to people about getting older? How has your perspective changed?
This is something that actually happens to me a fair amount, which concerns
I bet.
me. I worry a little bit. I'm like, please don't listen to what I have to tell you. I'm not a life coach, but I end up and talking about what I do for work sometimes. This is what ends up happening is I tell people how they should plan for old age.
Yes. You can't not, right? That's why I started this podcast, because so many of my friends were saying, what do I do? My parent is older. And so I'm like, okay, I got to get this message out to everyone. But anyway, tell me.
This happened to me recently at a wedding. And I think what I told to these people at this wedding was, one thing I talked about was the U-shaped curve of life satisfaction. It's like old age is the happiest time of life and midlife is tough. And they were like, they didn't know that. And suddenly they're thinking like, okay, I can expect that those middle years of my life, they're going to be challenging, and maybe I have to be ready for that. And maybe I can think more about old age as a time when I'm going to be happier. So I think that's kind of really powerful, where it's like, oh, like over my whole lifespan, I have this estimation of what I might be able to expect in terms of how my life is going to go. I think it's dangerous to put too much faith in that because it's social science research and it's talking about a population. Nobody knows what's going to happen to them, but sometimes that can be really powerful in capturing people's imaginations. And another thing I talk about with people around my age is about how, it's likely that they're going to be working longer than their parents did. They're probably going to be working past 65, and they're probably going to, well, in some cases at least, they're going to want to work past 65. They're going to reach 65 and they're going to still like their jobs and they're going to be really healthy and they're going to be like, I actually want to keep working. Or maybe I have to keep working because I've realized that I'm going to live to be 90 and I don't have enough money saved to be retired for 25 years. So sometimes I get into conversations with people my age about like, how do you imagine your working life in your 70s? What is that going to look like for you? What would you want to be doing for work? Or if you're not working, just in your life in your 70s? And that can be a really fun conversation. And a lot of people my age are like, I just hope I'm dead. And I'm like, no, you're probably not going to be dead. So rather than give into that fantasy, what if you're not? Then what? What do you do? And just to begin to kind of talk about that and explore a little bit, I think can be powerful, even if it's just fantasizing a little bit about what we could be doing as a healthy 80-year-old.
I love that. You're sprinkling the seeds of changing how people think about aging one wedding at a time.
And I ruined the wedding.
And then, that might not be a bad thing. You won't be invited to as many weddings. So, too many weddings can get a little tiresome. We have now, you've been fabulous, fabulous guest. We have a quick fast five lightning round where we want to get to, you, Adam, better. So give us your deep, dark secrets. Tell us what your favorite guilty pleasure is.
Okay. So this is another great one where I'm glad I could think about it in advance of the interview. I go on YouTube sometimes and I watch crappy videos. And one of the crappy genres of videos I like to watch is people playing video games really fast, what's called video game speed runs. There's something for me like utterly tranquilizing about this genre of YouTube video of watching somebody play a video game that I may have played when I was 8 years old, like impossibly fast. So that's one of my
Wow. Okay. I have not, this is a whole new genre to me. So I will have to dig into that.
No,
Not that I need
I
another.
don't recommend it. It could
Okay.
ruin your life.
Yeah, I spent too much time on screens as it is. All right. As a contrast, what's your favorite healthy practice?
Lately, as I enter into my 30s, I've started to really get into, not really, but I've started to get more into doing yoga as a way to develop flexibility and to just have. I love at the end of a yoga session, you just lie on your back for 5 minutes in the dark. And sometimes it's like the
Best
only
part.
5 minutes in an entire day where I relax. So I've really come to enjoy that practice lately.
Awesome. What kind of yoga do you do? Hot yoga, Ashtanga?
Oh God, I don't even know what they're called.
It's yoga.
It's yoga. They make me do a lot of lunges, whichever the one is where you're like basically doing lunges the whole time, but they have fancier names for it, like Warrior One.
Yeah. Warrior One,
Two.
Warrior Two. Yeah.
Like,
Okay.
this is just lunges, but fancy lunges. It's that kind.
Okay. Awesome. What is guaranteed to make you laugh?
So when I was a kid, I really loved the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And I watched it again recently, and the first like 30 minutes or so of that movie is just like nonstop killer bits. It's incredible how
Belly
good
laugh.
the
right?
first like 30 minutes. And then they kind of run out of jokes, and I kind of feel like the last hour of the movie is not as good. But there's this one scene in the movie that is, I know most people don't think it's funny as me, but it's these medieval monks are walking in a line and they're chanting in Latin, and then in unison, they all hit themselves in the head with a plank. And then they keep marching and then they hit themselves again with the plank. And something about that gag is so funny to me. And it was funny to me when I was a kid, and it still is now. And I don't understand why I think it's so funny for monks to hit themselves in the head with planks.
Okay.
But it gets me every time.
All right. I'm going to go
Pleasure.
back and rewatch that. I remember the shrubbery
Yes.
and a lot of other things from Monty Python. So I will go back and rewatch that. As somebody who reads incessantly, I have to ask, what's the last book that you loved?
I've been reading some James Joyce recently, and the centerpiece of my Joyce reading kick is a biography of Joyce by Richard Ellman, who is this great literary biographer. He wrote biographies, I think, of Oscar Wilde and William Butler Yeats and of Joyce. And this Joyce biography is really great. His life was so strange and he got up to so much weird stuff. And this biography just takes you through it in this comprehensive and brilliant way. And it's such a great book to read. It's an entertaining book, and it's easier to read than basically anything Joyce actually wrote. And helps you to maybe actually read Joyce if you want to. And it's just a fun book about a very fun literary figure. So that's
I will put that on my list because I did a Joyce course in college and read Ulysses and so I would love that. Thank you. And your favorite escape?
So going back to video game speed runs, or at least the genre of video games, is I was introduced to Nintendo and Super Mario when I was a kid, and those games for Nintendo still are just this like automatic palliative for me. They're just so joyful and colorful and well made and fun. And so I can always go back to a Mario game to
how wonderful.
good.
And how wonderful that is consistent with what you found joy as a child and now. It's like you can tap into not just the joy you're feeling now, but also everything that came before it.
And going back to longevity, it's the kind of thing that I'll probably be doing even when I'm 78 years old. There'll be like some impossibly sophisticated Mario game out, and I'll still be playing it because that's an activity you can do for your whole life. So
absolutely. And it's important to have those.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fantastic to have you on the show. I've learned a lot. I think our listeners have learned a lot. Thank you so much for sharing, Adam, everything that's going on, all the research that you've been doing on family caregivers. It's a really critical topic for us. And I appreciate your time today.
That's great. I'm so glad that I could chat with you too, Kathleen. It's been a lot of fun, and yeah, I really enjoyed it a lot. So thanks so much for having me on the show.
Good. I'm glad it wasn't too painful. That's our show for today. If it helped you think differently, can you help me? Hit the heart, like, plus, or subscribe button so we can reach more people. And tell your friends. We do want to change the way people think about aging. So the more people that listen, the better. Until then, enjoy the chance to get smarter about growing older. That's our show for today. If you liked it, please tell your friends so we can reach more minds and keep the conversation going. Or follow us on social at Seniority Authority. I'm Kathleen Toomey. Until next time, enjoy your chance to get smarter about growing older.